Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking into a really difficult one. The 1985 crash of Aero Air Flight 1285 in Gander, Newfoundland. It's still the deadliest air accident ever on Canadian soil. 256 people lost their lives, mostly U.S. soldiers heading home.
Yeah, it's a huge tragedy, and what makes it particularly challenging, I think, is how little solid evidence the investigators had to work with initially.
Yeah.
You've got this charter DC-8, an older plane, making a fuel stop.
Right.
And then it crashes right after takeoff in the dark. The scene was just immense destruction. And crucially, the cockpit voice recorder, basically useless. The data recorder was very primitive, gave them almost nothing.
So very little black box data. And from that difficult start, this massive split developed in the investigation. Not just technical disagreements, but, well, it seemed to become quite political almost.
Exactly. It ended up with two totally different official conclusions. The majority pointed towards ice on the wings combined with the plane being significantly heavier than calculated.
Okay.
But a very vocal minority, they insisted it had to be an in-flight explosion. Maybe accidental, maybe deliberate.
And this disagreement wasn't just about this one crash, was it? It kind of exposed this pre-existing tension within the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, the CASB.
That's a really key point.
Yeah.
This conflict over Air basically blew the lid off existing problems at the CASB. And it ultimately contributed to the whole board being dismantled, left a real legacy of uncertainty around this crash.
So that's what we want to unpack today. We'll look at these two competing theories, the evidence, or maybe the lack of evidence for each, and try to understand why this accident is still so controversial, even now.
Yeah, we'll be digging into some detailed analyses of the reports and, the whole context of that investigation.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Aero Air itself, what kind of airline were they?
Well, they were kind of a jack-of-all-trades outfit,
Yeah.
Used older aircraft, did cargo, charters, and they had this contract, relatively short-term, with the U.S. Department of Defense for troop transport.
Right, transporting the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, to and from peacekeeping in the Sinai.
Exactly, part of the Multinational Force and Observers mission. So this flight, 1285, was bringing troops home. Cairo, Cologne, Gander, then heading towards Kentucky.
And the plane itself, N950JW, a DC-8 from '69, sounds like it might have been showing its age a bit.
Yeah, reports suggest it was, a bit shabby. Worn interior, and there were recurring maintenance logs, things like hydraulic leaks, water leaks. Engine number 4 apparently had a recurring issue with high exhaust gas temps.
Okay.
And even a flickering light related to a thrust reverser. Little things, maybe, but signs of an aging aircraft.
But the flight to Gander from Cologne, that was okay?
Seems so. Uneventful crossing. They landed in Gander, pre-dawn darkness. Weather's dreary, overcast, light snow, some snow grains. Critically, some other pilots reported very light freezing drizzle.
Freeze and drizzle. Okay, that sounds potentially significant. But they didn't ask for de-icing, even though it was available.
No, they didn't. And the airport's own ice detection system did show some minor buildup. Rough textured ice, apparently.
But not enough for the crew to feel they needed de-icing.
Apparently not. Practice at the time was often different. Less proactive, maybe, unless you saw significant visible ice.
Yeah.
Some pilots landing nearby reported icing on approach, others didn't. So maybe a bit inconsistent.
Okay, so after about an hour on the ground, refueling, checks. They taxi out for takeoff, runway 32, but they had to start from an intersection because of snow.
Right, so a bit less runway available, about 9,900 feet. The takeoff roll itself seemed normal at first. Acceleration looked okay.
What then?
But then it just didn't climb properly. Witnesses saw it fly incredibly low over the end of the runway, over the Trans-Canada Highway, just barely clearing it.
Wow.
No distress call, nothing. And then it hit the trees in the ground.
Devastating. Nose high, right wing low, you said.
Yeah, that was the impact attitude. Tore through the woods, huge fire, fuel tanks ignited. Just a horrific scene. No survivors.
So the investigation starts. Canadians with U.S. NTSB help, but facing that lack of recorder data.
A huge challenge. Their early focus, based on wreckage and witnesses, was just failure to gain altitude. And that impact attitude knows high angle of attack around 21 degrees.
Which is way above the stall angle for a DC-8.
Exactly. So an aerodynamic stall seemed like a very strong possibility right from the start. The wings just weren't generating enough lift to climb.
But proving it without the recorders.
Very difficult. They had that primitive FDR data, airspeed, heading, altitude, vertical acceleration, time. But the vertical acceleration track was unreliable, out of sync.
So what could they piece together from what little they had?
Well, they figured out the liftoff happened further down the runway and at a higher speed than you'd expect for the weight listed on the paperwork. And, crucially, the airspeed peaked shortly after liftoff, then decreased before impact.
Decreased. That points towards a stall, right? Losing lift, losing speed.
Certainly consistent with the stall scenario. Which brings us to the weight issue. This became a major part of the majority report.
The plane was heavier than they thought.
Significantly heavier. They found multiple underestimations. The plane's basic empty weight was off by about 1,000 pounds.
Okay.
Cargo weight was underestimated by another 1,000 pounds or so. But the big one was passenger weight.
Ah, the soldiers and their gear.
Exactly. Air used a standard average, about 170 pounds per person. But these were soldiers coming home from deployment, lots of gear, probably souvenirs.
Right.
The investigators estimated the actual average was closer to 220 pounds per person. That difference alone added up to maybe 12,000 pounds.
12,000 pounds just from the passengers and carry-ons. Wow.
Yeah. So you add it all up, empty weight, cargo, passengers. The estimate was the plane was about 14,000 pounds heavier than the load sheet said, around 344,450 pounds total.
That's a lot. Like you said, an extra small plane's worth of weight almost.
It's a significant difference. Now, on its own, that overload probably wouldn't bring down a DC-8.
But it affects performance calculations.
Critically. Especially takeoff speeds, the V speeds. If the pilots calculated their rotation speed, VR, based on that incorrect lower weight.
They'd lift the nose too early.
Potentially, yes. Rotating too early at too low an airspeed increases drag, and really importantly, it eats into your safety margin above the stall speed. They couldn't definitively prove the pilots used the wrong speeds because the airspeed bugs in the cockpit were unreliable after the crash, but it fit the scenario.
Okay, so underestimated weight leading to potentially early rotation. What about mechanical failure? The plane had issues.
They looked very hard at that. Engine 4, the one with the high temp history, there was some inconclusive evidence it might have been producing lower power at impact. But simulations showed even losing engine 4 completely shouldn't have prevented a climb.
Right.
No strong evidence of pre-impact failures in the flight controls. Flaps seemed okay, though their position at impact was inconsistent. And the thrust reversers looked like they were stowed, like they should be for takeoff. So no smoking gun mechanically.
Which brings us back to the weather. The ice.
Yes. This became the other key pillar of the majority report. You have those reports of freezing drizzle, snow grains, other pilots reporting ice on approach. The flight engineers comment about picking up a little ice earlier, and the airport's own sensor showing rough ice building up.
Like sandpaper on the wing, you said.
That's the analogy. Even a thin layer of rough, clear ice can dramatically disrupt airflow over the wing. The CASB calculated they could have picked up maybe a quarter inch, maybe even a bit more of this kind of ice.
And back then, maybe they wouldn't have seen that as a major threat.
It's quite possible. The understanding of just how dangerous even small amounts of clear or rough ice could be wasn't as widespread. De-icing wasn't automatic unless you saw, chunks of ice hanging off.
So how does that ice affect the plane?
Critically, it reduces the angle of attack the wing can reach before it stalls. So the stall happens earlier at a lower nose-up angle. It also reduces overall lift and significantly increases drag. Makes the plane want to slow down and harder to climb.
And the stall warning system might not even work correctly.
Right, because it's calibrated for a clean wing. With ice changing the aerodynamics, the warning might come too late, or not at all. And the DC-8 was known to be a bit tricky in pitch control with ice on the wings.
Okay, so the majority's picture is underestimated weight leads to early rotation, reducing the stall margin. Then add ice, which further reduces the stall margin and increases drag. The pilots pull back to climb. The angle of attack needed exceeds the now reduced stall angle.
And you get an aerodynamic stall very shortly after liftoff. The plane simply couldn't sustain flight. That was the most probable scenario, according to the majority investigation.
Okay, makes sense based on the physics.
Yeah.
But then you have the minority report, the explosion theory. Air pushed this hard, right?
They did. They hired consultants. And a group of the CASB board members dissented, arguing strongly for an explosion. It became very contentious.
What was their evidence for an explosion? They mentioned pedaling metal.
Yeah, they pointed to some fuselage pieces that were bent outwards, arguing it must have been an internal blast. But the forensic analysis, RCMP did it, found zero explosive residue. And accident investigators know that metal can bend outwards in severe crashes just from the forces involved. It wasn't proved.
Did they look into sabotage? There was that claim by Islamic Jihad.
They did, but found absolutely no evidence to support it. Ruled it out pretty quickly.
What about the weapons on board, the soldiers' gear?
They found unloaded weapons matched the manifest, some inert training stuff, nothing illicit, nothing that looked like it had detonated. And critically, all the wreckage was at the crash site. If there had been an in-flight explosion, you'd expect debris scattered before the main impact point. There wasn't any.
Okay. What about the victims who inhaled smoke? The minority pointed to that.
They did, suggesting an in-flight fire. But the detailed medical analysis indicated it was almost certainly post-impact smoke inhalation from the ground fire. The victims hadn't died instantly.
So how did the minority dismiss the ice theory?
They basically called it theoretical, downplayed the flight engineer's comment, argued the experienced captain wouldn't have taken off with significant ice.
Which, as you said, kind of ignores the context of 1985 icing awareness.
Exactly. Back then, what they might perceive as significant could be different. The danger of small amounts of clear-off ice wasn't fully appreciated industry-wide.
Did the minority believe the plane stalled at all?
They argued it didn't. They tried to explain away the altitude fluctuations as just normal for a heavy takeoff, but didn't really provide data for that. They even questioned the calculated impact angle of attack.
So they challenged the core aerodynamic findings.
Pretty much. They disputed the lift and drag calculations related to ice, saying the majority overestimated the effect of, quote, minute amounts of equivalent roughness.
So if not ice and stall, what was their alternative explanation for the flight path?
This is where it gets really complex. They proposed a simultaneous failure of all 4 engines right after liftoff.
All 4 at once.
Yes. As a better fit for the flight path, they claimed. Based on, again, very limited and contested evidence, some witness accounts of low engine noise, the uncertain status of engine 4.
That seems highly improbable, mechanically.
Yeah. Extremely improbable. And they didn't stop there. They suggested all 4 thrust reversers deployed at impact again, contradicting the majority evidence without explaining how that could possibly happen simultaneously.
Wow. Okay. What else?
They saw the extended landing gear as proof of a hydraulic failure, rather than maybe the crew just being overwhelmed in an emergency.
Grasping at straws, almost.
It starts to feel that way. They brought back the explosion idea later in their report, too. Pointed to witness accounts of a glow could have been landing lights. Speculated about lax security in Cairo, allowing a bomb on board, even though the group claiming responsibility had a history of false claims.
Any specific bomb theory?
They even floated the idea of an accidental explosion, maybe a military souvenir like a magnesium flare, but there was zero evidence anything like that was on board.
And they dismissed the lack of explosive residue.
Yeah, they argued it could have just weathered away. Criticized the lack of a full airframe reconstruction. Their final conclusion was a catastrophic explosion under the aircraft caused multiple system failures and loss of control.
So a completely different picture based on much more speculative evidence, it sounds like.
That's certainly how the majority and many outside observers saw it. The 2 reports were fundamentally incompatible.
And this split had huge consequences. The minority report got appended to the official one in '88.
Right, which is unusual, and created this official record of deep division. And a key figure pushing the explosion theory was Lev Filota, an aeronautical engineer, but a political appointee to the CASB board with no actual crash investigation experience. He was apparently unhappy with the board's role, distrusted the professional investigators. It became quite political internally. It really highlights the risks when investigation bodies have that kind of potential for internal political conflict.
And the dissenting members went public.
Very public. Media blitz, accusations of a cover-up, blaming pilot error. They even contacted victims' families directly and sadly convinced many of them to back the explosion theory.
That's tragic. Must have caused so much more pain.
Absolutely. And the CASB just lost all credibility. There were calls to disband it. A judicial review in '89 basically said neither side had proven its case definitively.
Which sounds like an impossible standard for an accident investigation.
Many thought so. You often work with probabilities, not absolute certainty. Anyway, Parlin acted. CASB was dissolved in June '89, and the Transportation Safety Board, the TSB, was created in 1990.
With a different structure.
Yeah, smaller board. And crucially, board members were explicitly removed from direct investigation work, trying to prevent that kind of internal conflict again.
So Aero Air's legacy is this enduring controversy.
Profound controversy, yeah. The ice and weight theory has strong scientific backing, fits the limited data, aligns with known aerodynamic principles. But the explosion theory, despite lacking solid evidence, still persists, fueled by that initial dissent and the ongoing grief.
So wrapping this up, we have the majority report. Weight issues, early rotation, wing icing, leading to an aerodynamic stall, supported by performance analysis, weather data. Seems scientifically plausible.
Plausible and probable. Based on the available evidence, yes. It fits what we know about aviation hazards.
And the minority report. Relying heavily on speculation, questionable interpretations of witness accounts, dismissing forensic evidence, proposing highly improbable scenarios like simultaneous engine failures or an undetected explosion.
Right. It seems driven more by a refusal to accept the more mundane, though equally tragic, explanation involving ice and weight, perhaps complicated by that internal CASB conflict.
And the damage done by that internal conflict was immense. It undermined the investigation, led to the board's demise, and just prolonged the uncertainty and pain for the families.
Terribly so. This case is just such a stark reminder of, well, several things. The dangers in aviation, obviously, but also how vital, independent, expert-led investigation is, free from politics.
Yeah.
And it shows how easily misinformation, especially when tied to strong emotions, can cloud the picture and leave this lasting, painful legacy.
It really does. And it leaves us, and you, the listener, with that difficult question, doesn't it? In tragedies like this, where the evidence isn't perfect, how do you balance that need for absolute answers, which is so human, with accepting the most probable explanation based on the facts you do have?
It's a tough balance, and Air 1285 is just a heartbreaking example of what can happen when that balance is lost.